Welcome back. Now, one thing I want you to notice is that the gun in our character's hands has the glowing effect on it, and that's because that weapon is set to start the game with the glow material enabled. So we're going to go ahead and disable that for the default weapon. So let's go into our shooter character.cpp, and we have a function called spawn default weapon. Now in spawn default weapon, we are spawning the weapon that we're going to equip by default. Now once we've spawned that weapon, what we'd like to do is take that weapon and disable the glow material as well as the outline. So we're going to say equipped weapon disable custom depth, and also we're going to want to call disable glow material. But recall on item.h disable glow material is protected. So in order to call this from the shooter character class, we're going to want to make this public. So we're going to put this way down here at the public section. So now we can call this in shooter character. So we're going to say equipped weapon disable glow material. Now let's go ahead and compile this, and we should see that the glow material is disabled on the default weapon. Okay, so we're back in the editor and we see that our weapon starts off without the glow material. And if we go ahead and swap weapons, well then we just threw our gun down and now it has the material enabled. Okay, so that takes care of that little detail. Now in this video, we're going to work on creating a curve that will drive some of the values in our glow material. So let's go ahead and get started. Now let's go into our curves folder. So it's an underscore game curves, and we're going to create a new curve. So right click, and in miscellaneous, we're going to choose curve, and the type that we're going to choose is curve vector. So we can have a vector curve. Go ahead and click select, and we're going to call this curve material pulse curve. Material pulse curve. Because we'd like our material to have some sort of pulse activity, and we're going to use the curve to drive that. Now double click on material pulse curve and you'll get this curve asset. Now this curve is basically like some of the other curves we've worked with, only it's got an X, Y, and Z component to it. So it's really three curves in one. That's really what a curve vector is. It's just three float curves, and they're just called X, Y, and Z. Now we're going to use the X, Y, and Z for different parameters on our glow material. So let's go ahead and create some variables on our item class. So let's go back into Visual Studio. Here we are in item.h, and we're going to add some private variables. Now the first private variable I'm going to create is a uCurve vector. So it's going to be forward declared. It'll be uCurve vector. It's a pointer, and I'm going to call this pulse curve. Now we can give this a U property, and I'm going to make this edit defaults only, blueprint read only, and for the category, I'll give it item properties and leave the meta in there. Allow private access equals true, and I'm going to give this a comment. So I'm going to say curve to drive the dynamic material parameters. Now, in addition to this curve, we're also going to have an F timer handle, since we're going to start a timer in order to get the values from our curve. So we're going to do an F timer handle, and we're going to call this pulse timer. And we're also going to have a float for the pulse curve time. So we're going to call this pulse curve time. And pulse curve time can also be edit defaults only, blueprint read only. So let's go ahead and copy the U property for pulse curve and use that for pulse curve time. We're going to give this a comment and say time for the pulse timer. Now this curve vector is going to have three values, and we're going to use this curve to set the values of some variables that we'll create here on the item class. Now those variables are going to correspond to parameters on our glow material. Now recall we had a glow amount, so we're going to create a float called glow amount. Now what is this glow amount? Well, let's remind ourselves. Back here in the editor, if we go into materials, SMG materials, and we take a look at our MSMG matte instance, this is the material instance, you'll see that we have this glow amount, and we can change the glow amount. If it goes down to 0, then we basically have 0 of that glow material, but if we put it up, then we'll have more of the glow material. So that is going to be what the glow amount variable is going to represent. Now we're going to make this a U property. And I'm going to make this visible anywhere. And I'll just give it the category and meta keyword. Now we don't want to set this in blueprints because this is going to be driven by the curve. Now we're going to create another float with the same U property, and this one's going to be called Fresnel exponent. This was the Fresnel exponent material parameter that drives that Fresnel effect. And we're going to also create another float, and this one's going to be called Fresnel reflect fraction. And so we've already seen how these parameters can change our glow material. Now we're going to give these default values in item.cpp, so let's go up to the constructor here. And first we're going to put a comment and say dynamic material parameters. And this first one is called glow amount. And let's give this a value of 150.f. Next we have Fresnel exponent. And we'll give this one a value of 3.f. And then we have Fresnel reflect fraction. And this one will give a value of 4.f. And then of course we have our pulse curve time, and we're going to give this pulse curve time a value of 5 for 5 seconds for the curve. And that'll help us drive our material parameters. So we have these values, and we want to create the curve that will drive these values. So let's go back into the editor and take a look at material pulse curve. Now let's use X for the glow amount. That's this first one. And so we can right click and add a key. And if we click the key and drag it down, we'll see that it's the Y. This is the Y component of this curve. And you can see that it's green, which is the color given to the Y. Now we can right click back up here on the 0 mark and add another key. And if we drag this one, I'll drag it up, you'll see that this one is the Z, and what's left here is the X, and we can right click on that and add a key, and now we have values for X, Y, and Z. So now that we have the X, we're going to want to give X its own curve. Let's have X start with 0 for the first value and 1 for the second value. Now I'm going to scroll out so that we can see where 0 and 1 is on the curve. Now let's right click on the red line and add another key, and for this one, with this one selected, let's go up to 5 for 5 seconds, and we'll put its value at 0. So this curve goes from 1 to 0. In other words, in 5 seconds, this glow amount is just going to fade to 0. Now we can select these points, both of them, and right click and create a auto curve, and so that way it's not a straight line but a smooth curve. Now we can actually select one of these at a time and modify its handle so we can get the curve to look how we want it to look. I'm going to have it come down in a smooth manner like this. So that's going to be our glow amount. For the Fresnel exponent, I'm going to use Y. Now for Y, I'm going to start it off at 0, and I'm going to create another key, and for the second key I'll put it at 5 seconds, and I'm going to have it go up to 1. Now I'm going to select these keys on the Y curve, right click and select auto. Now I'm going to select the second key and move the handle so that my curve looks like this. Now the Z component is going to be our Fresnel reflect factor. I'm going to select this first key on the Z curve, and I'm going to start it off at 0 and 0. So the Z curve will start at 0, 0. Now I'm going to add another key to the Z curve, and I'd like this to go down to -1 at 1 second. So it's going to be 1 and -1. So in a single second, it's going to sink down to -1. And I want it to stay at -1 for the rest of the curve. So I'm going to add another key value here at the very end at 5 seconds and keep it at -1. Now I'm going to select the first key on the Z curve and choose auto. And I'll take the second key and I'll right click and choose brake, and that way I can have two handles for the second key. And I'm going to select the left side and I'm going to have it go up like this, so that way the curve goes down in this shape. Now I'm going to select all of the keys and come up here where it says zoom to fit, and that way I can see this a little bit better. So we now have keys for glow amount, that's the X, Fresnel exponent, that's the Y, and the Z is the Fresnel reflect factor. Now the reason I decided to have these values do what they do is because I went into the material instance and I dragged these sliders around, and I thought, how should these change as a function of time? And that's how I came up with this set of curves here. Okay, so now let's find out how to kick off this curve in C++ to drive our material parameters. So here in item.cpp, I'm going to scroll down to begin play, and here's where I'd like to start the timer. Now, I'd like the timer to be started if the item is in the pickup state. So I'm going to do a check to see if item state is equal to item state pickup. Because I don't really want this timer to be going, I don't want it to be pulsing unless the item is sitting there in the pickup state. It's ready to be picked up off the ground. Now, if this check succeeds, then we can set the timer. But in order to set the timer, we need a callback function that will be called at the end of the timer. So let's go ahead and create that. So in item.h, let's create a function, and we can just keep it down here with our pulse variables. It's okay that this is a private function. And let's make this a void function called reset pulse timer. And I'll go ahead and give this a definition. And in this function definition, we're going to simply check to see if we're in the item state, item state pickup. And if so, we're going to start the timer. Basically the same thing we want to do in begin play, which means that this would be good to put into its own function. So if the state is in EIS pickup, we're going to get world timer manager and set timer, and we're going to use the pulse timer. The second argument is this, and the third is the function callback, which is going to be a item reset pulse timer. And we're going to use the pulse curve time. That's right, the callback function for set timer is going to be the actual function that we're calling it in. That means as soon as this timer is done, this function will be called again, and we'll go ahead and set the timer again if the item is in the pickup state. But if it's not, if it was picked up and equipped or something else happened to it, then this if check will fail and we will stop calling the timer. Now, since we're going to do this exact same thing in begin play, we might as well make a function called start pulse timer. So let's go ahead and put that right under reset pulse timer. Void start pulse timer. And we'll go ahead and give this its own function definition. And I'm going to copy this code from reset pulse timer and stick it in start pulse timer. That way we can simply call start pulse timer here and reset pulse timer instead. And we can also call start pulse timer in begin play. So let's go to begin play, And instead of checking here, we can simply call start pulse timer, which performs the check and starts the timer. So we now have a timer started, and all it does at the end of it is checks to see if we're in the pickup state and calls start pulse timer again. But while this timer is running, we need to do something with our curve. And we can create a function that we can call in tick that will get our curve values. I'm going to call this update pulse, and I'm going to stick it in the protected section. So we're going to say void update pulse. That's a function. And I'm going to go ahead and define it here in item.cpp. And here is where we're going to get our curve value and set our floats that we created. Now we're going to be using the curve, and that means we need to include the proper header file. Now the header file for a curve vector is going to be curves/curve vector. And you can always get the include on the Unreal Engine documentation. Now we're going to go back down to update pulse and implement this curve. Now update pulse should only be called if we're in the pickup state. We only want the item to pulse when we're in the pickup state. So we're first going to check if item state is equal to item state, and we're going to choose pickup. In fact, we can say if item state is not equal to pickup, then return. And then we don't have to do anything else. Now let's get the elapsed time on our timer. Now we can do that by creating a const local float. And we're going to call this elapsed time. And we're going to set this equal to get world timer manager. And from that, we're going to say get timer elapsed. And this takes a timer handle. We're going to say pulse timer. So now we have a local variable that is the elapsed time while this timer is running. Next, we're going to get our curve. So we're going to check to see if pulse curve is set. Now, if it is, then we're going to get our curve value. So this will be a const f vector, and we're going to call this curve value, and we'll initialize it with pulse curve get vector value. And this returns the vector with our x, y, z values, and this function requires the curve time, so we're going to pass in elapsed time. And now we have an f vector with our x, y, and z. Now we can use those values to set parameters on our material instance. And we can set those parameters by doing the following. We can say dynamic material instance, and we can say set scalar parameter value. We're going to use a text macro to name the parameter value, and the first one we're going to set is glow amount. And the glow amount is going to be the curve value dot x, which is that x component. Now remember, let's take a look at our curve again. This glow amount starts at 0 and fades down to 1 at 5 seconds. So what we want to do is scale this by the float that we created called glow amount here in our class. Remember, we created glow amount and we initialized it to a value in the constructor. We're going to use that glow amount as a sort of factor to multiply by the curve value. So we're going to say times glow amount. So that's how we set the material instance for glow amount. Now we're going to set the material instance for the Fresnel exponent. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this line and paste it just beneath. But this time, instead of glow amount, we're setting Fresnel exponent. And we're going to use curve value dot y for this, and we're scaling it by our Fresnel exponent variable this time. So Fresnel exponent here. And finally, we'll paste this line again, only this time we're going to set Fresnel reflect fraction. And this will be the curve value z, and we're scaling it by our variable Fresnel reflect fraction. Say that 3 times fast. So this is going to be our update pulse function, and this needs to be called every frame. So we're going to call this in tick. So we'll set this right here under item interp, and we'll give this a comment. I'm going to say get curve values from pulse curve and set dynamic material parameters. Okay, so before we compile this, I'm going to take care of one more thing, and that's when we're in the weapon stop falling function. Let's go ahead and go to that. Here we're going to start the pulse timer because we've just thrown the weapon down and it's going to be put right here in the EIS pickup state. So here we're going to call start pulse timer. Now the reason we can't call this is, of course, if we go into item.h, we'll see start pulse timer was put in the private section. Now we usually make these protected, so I'm going to actually take reset pulse timer and start pulse timer and stick those up in the protected section, right here next to update pulse. Now in weapon.cpp we can call start pulse timer. Okay, so we've compiled and we're back in the editor, and let's start the game and see that we've got our weapons and they're all pulsing. So that looks great. Now I can go ahead and pick up one of the weapons and throw one down, and the weapon we picked up will stop pulsing and the one we threw down will start pulsing. So everything seems to be behaving correctly. So that is going to conclude this video. In the next video, we're going to work on creating another pulse, and we want this pulse to fire off when the weapon is interping so that we get a nice flash when the weapon flies up at our face, and so it'll have a different type of curve than the curve it's playing while it's in the pickup state. We'll see you in the next video.